Welcome to this explainer. Now, pretty much every textbook you've ever read presents the agricultural revolution as humanity's greatest achievement. The glorious moment when our ancestors stopped chasing their food and ingeniously decided to start growing it. But the archaeological and skeletal evidence tells a radically different story. Human agriculture was absolutely not a conscious, deliberate upgrade. Nobody chose it. It wasn't a discovery made by ancient visionaries. Instead, it was a brutal, irreversible demographic trap sprung in the immediate aftermath of a planetary climate catastrophe.
This brings us to biologist Jared Diamond, who, famously and controversially, argued that the shift from foraging to farming was actually the worst mistake in the history of the human race. In his provocative 1987 essay, Diamond pointed out that by every biological measure, the transition to agriculture did not enrich human life. It actively impoverished it. The individuals who made this transition suffered immensely.
So we are faced with the ultimate paradox. If early agriculture was objectively terrible for the people practicing it, why did it become the inescapable foundation of modern human existence? Today, all 8 billion of us depend entirely on agricultural food systems. Cities, science, medicine, writing, none of these exist without the surplus food that agriculture produces. We really need to understand how humanity got locked into a system that was worse for the individual, but somehow conquered the globe. To figure that out, we have to look at the timeline.
Consider the sheer weight of human history for a second. For 200,000 years, modern humans thrived perfectly well as cognitively advanced hunter-gatherers. The people who painted the caves at Lascaux and navigated open oceans to Australia were biologically identical to us. They had a highly successful subsistence strategy, and they definitely weren't just waiting around for someone to invent farming. But then, abruptly, immediately following the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe about 12,800 years ago, 5 independent agricultural transitions erupted, from the Fertile Crescent to China to the Americas.
Now, what triggered 5 simultaneous agricultural revolutions? We have to ask what specific environmental pressure forced completely isolated cultures across the globe to independently abandon foraging within a tightly clustered 3,000-year window. A single invention? Sure, you could attribute that to local genius. But 5 independent inventions, featuring entirely different crops on opposite sides of the planet, that demands a common cause. For 200,000 years, nobody invented agriculture. Then, after the worst climate collapse in modern human history, everybody did. The environmental stress wiped out the abundant wild resources humans relied on, forcing a desperate change in behavior.
We can actually see exactly how this unfolded in the dirt itself. Take the excavation site at Abu Huraira in Syria. It reveals a direct chronological sequence from catastrophe straight to domesticated crops. The lowest stratigraphic layers show a thriving hunter-gatherer community exploiting a rich, abundant environment. Then you hit the Younger Dryas boundary layer, complete with melt glass consistent with a massive cosmic airburst event. Immediately above that layer, the diverse plant food completely disappears due to a colder, drier climate. The surviving humans are forced into the intensive, desperate exploitation of the few remaining wild cereal plants. And finally, the top layers reveal the morphological changes that mark fully domesticated grains.
What this brilliantly illustrates is that populations under severe post-impact resource stress did not invent farming in a spark of genius. They were mathematically forced into intensive plant management just to survive. The people at Abu Huraira didn't want to become farmers. They were making incremental day-to-day adaptations to a world that had been catastrophically transformed. Each small step to manage wild grains made the next step necessary, until they crossed the threshold into total reliance on agriculture. The climate catastrophe and the agricultural revolution happened in the exact same place at the exact same time.
And the physical cost of this transition was staggering. The skeletal record reveals a brutal truth. Early farmers were shorter, sicker, and worked relentlessly harder than the foragers they systematically replaced. When physical anthropologists compare the bones of pre-agricultural humans with early farmers, the decline is undeniable. Farmers were, on average, 5 to 10 centimeters shorter due to chronic childhood malnutrition. Their diets shifted from a rich variety of proteins to a narrow, starchy, cereal-heavy diet, which completely destroyed their dental health. On top of that, settled living alongside domesticated animals birthed zoonotic epidemics. The first farmers were the first victims of the infectious diseases that have plagued civilization ever since. To truly understand the devastating physical toll, we just have to analyze the specific data from the Dixon Mound's skeletal site. The adoption of maize agriculture there triggered massive health spikes, and the numbers are unambiguous. We see a 50% increase in enamel defects, which points directly to starving children. We see a 400% surge in iron deficiency anemia. That is a 4 times increase, showing a catastrophic drop in dietary quality. And there is a 300% jump in infectious bone lesions, highlighting a society absolutely ravaged by disease. They also suffered severe spinal arthritis from the grueling repetitive labor of processing grain. By every measurable metric, their quality of life absolutely plummeted.
So how did this happen? We can explain this historical lock-in through something called the demographic ratchet. It is a ruthless mathematical trap that rendered any return to the healthier hunter-gatherer lifestyle physically impossible. Here is how it works. Once a population begins farming, the amount of food produced per acre skyrockets. This surplus immediately triggers rapid population growth. Within just a few generations, the community grows so large that the surrounding wild landscape can no longer support them. The trap springs shut. They are permanently locked into the grueling labor of agriculture, purely to sustain their newly inflated numbers. The reason agriculture eradicated foraging entirely comes down to sheer volume. A single unit of cultivated land produces between 10 to 100 times more calories than wild foraging. And those numbers overwhelm lower-density groups regardless of individual biological suffering. 10 to 100 times more calories literally means 10 to 100 times more people. The hunter-gatherer bands may have possessed superior individual health, much better diets, and far more free time, but they simply could not compete with the enormous volume of bodies an agricultural society could field. This is a crucial distinction. Agriculture did not win by offering a better life. It won strictly through superior demographic mathematics and military density. The individual farmer paid a devastating biological cost, suffering through disease and malnourishment. However, the agricultural population as a whole collected a massive demographic dividend. They had more children. They formed much larger settlements. They eventually supported professional armies. In the grand sweep of human history, raw numbers always beat quality of life. And once that population trap was sprung, the cycle accelerated. Early farmers inevitably faced severe soil depletion, forcing a relentless geographic expansion that closely mirrored modern ecological overshoot. Early farming relied heavily on slash-and-burn tactics. They would clear a forest, grow crops until the soil nutrients were completely exhausted, and watch their crop yields plummet. Because their dense populations couldn't simply return to foraging, they had only one choice. They had to expand outward, violently if necessary, to claim fresh land. Ancient DNA clearly confirms this relentless expansion. Incoming Anatolian farmers comprehensively replaced European foragers. And this wasn't through peaceful cultural persuasion, it was through unstoppable, land-hungry reproductive volume. Between 9,000 and 5,000 years ago, farmers expanding out of modern Turkey pushed into Europe. The native hunter-gatherers didn't look at these diseased, overworked farmers and decide to adopt their lifestyle. They were simply demographically overwhelmed. The farmers bred faster, filled the territory, and either absorbed or displaced the native populations entirely. This trap of agricultural surplus triggered a massive chain of unintended consequences. It ultimately birthed the very first cities and created the absolute need for complex bureaucracy. Because agriculture produced a caloric surplus, society could finally support individuals who did not farm, people like priests, soldiers, and bureaucrats. This division of labor allowed populations to concentrate into early, high-density cities. But managing the massive granaries required to feed a city demanded an unprecedented level of organization. Human memory alone was no longer sufficient to track who owed what to the central grain stores.
Which brings us to the ultimate historical irony. Writing was not invented for poetry or philosophy or history. In the Sumerian city of Uruk 5,200 years ago, it emerged specifically to track barley receipts for the administrative state. The wedge-shaped marks of early cuneiform are entirely pragmatic. They are tax records, they are debt obligations, they are livestock inventories. The foundational technology of human civilization, the tool that allows us to record knowledge across generations, was invented by a desperate accountant trying to manage the agricultural surplus generated by a demographic trap.
But the profound poetry of this causality chain is what happened next. That exact wedge-shaped script, invented solely to record agricultural surplus, was later used to record the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is humanity's oldest surviving literature, And what is it about? It contains the ancient cultural memory of a devastating global flood, a catastrophic event echoing the very climate collapse that forced humans into agriculture in the first place. It is a complete cycle. The survivors of the Younger Dryas catastrophe inadvertently built a demographic trap, which eventually produced the exact technological tool required to write down the memory of the flood that started the whole thing. Think about that chain of events. A comet strikes, the climate collapses, hunter-gatherers are forced into an agricultural trap just to survive. The population explodes, cities form, bureaucracy demands writing, and centuries later, scribes use that exact administrative script to finally write down the story of the flood that ruined their ancestors' world. The catastrophe effectively encoded its own origin story.
So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If everything we know today, all of human civilization, is merely the unintended consequence of an inescapable demographic trap, built by survivors desperately responding to an ancient climate catastrophe, what irreversible ratchets are we engaging right now? The mammoth hunters who planted the first wheat seeds in the Fertile Crescent didn't know they were starting civilization, they were just trying to eat. They engaged a trap that changed the planet forever. As we face our own modern ecological pressures and deploy massive new technological systems, we have to ask ourselves, what permanent traps are we springing today, completely unaware of the civilization our descendants will be forced to build in the aftermath?